So, all of this concern about the threat of enemy aliens, the threat of illegal aliens, the concern that these undocumented residents do not have enough equity developed in American society, according to the author, is a direct reaction to a crisis of Fordism. You can see here on the screen a really good example of Fordism. You see the word Ford right there in the term. This is more or less the style of economy that emerged in the early 1900s following Ford's mass production of automobiles and just sort of the standardization of the industrialization process. Just like previous robber barons and previous tycoons, Ford really depended on underpaid or low paid immigrant work. He offered a relatively good pay. People still wanted to work for him, but it was definitely not something that was going to be thrusting you up into the upper classes anytime soon. And alongside his very decent pay, I think it was $5 a day. I think that was sort of the big marker he had, and he advertised that. In line with that, you had to also live in government houses. You had to have your corporate boss have some vision over your daily life, making sure your house is clean and your family's acclimating to the United States well. So this crisis sort of collapsed in the 1970s when manufacturing started to go overseas, and the threat of people from outside the country to the economy was more or less becoming a little bit more perceivable. And because of that, you have people that are starting to be concerned about cheap labor coming in from outside. This prosperity that has been around for a few generations has sort of dwindled. Mass deportations and mass incarceration have sort of paralleled one another. I think it's interesting, but it also is interesting to note how the number of people who are incarcerated, the vast majority, it's much more likely for you to be a native born citizen than someone who is a first generation migrant. So there is this argument that immigrants bring trouble, they bring crime, and the stats show that it's the Americans, the people that have been born here, that are causing most of the crime. We have the Alien Enemies Act. I mentioned this briefly throughout the earlier parts of the lecture. I thought it may be good for me to bring it up here at the end, just as a really good example of how some of these immigration laws can become full circle and how they've been protested throughout time. So Donald Trump's been using this 1798 Alien Enemies Act to deport Venezuelan and El Salvadorian people accused of gang affiliations. And it's pretty controversial. And it was controversial in 1798. It was controversial in other times in American history when it was used as well. So in 1798, you see that John Adams, one of the first presidents, was concerned about the French spreading news about him and speaking ill and organizing negatively about him. So he went out and he arrested a bunch of French nationals and said, get out of the country. It allowed the president to detain or deport any immigrant from a country at war with the U.S. without a hearing, purely based on a country of birth or citizenship. The Alien Enemies Act was part of the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were all very controversial. A four-part set of laws created to support the American war effort against France. They included Alien Friends Act, gave the president power to deport any immigrant they considered dangerous without court process. So it's just, we think you're dangerous, get out of the country. Don't even get a day in court. Naturalization Act increased the residency requirement for citizenship from 5 to 14 years. I believe it's 5 years again. So they got rid of that long, decade long wait that you had to have, and you could most likely get citizenship in this early era in 5 years. And then Sedition Act criminalized criticism of both Congress and the president. And there's still some rules like this in places like Brazil. I'm pretty scared to speak out or go to a political protest in Brazil sometimes because there are rules in the book. So, why was France between 1796 and 1797? France started seizing all these merchant ships. This was in the sort of early Napoleonic era as well, right? The action and America's new pro British foreign policy resulted in a quasi war from 1798 to 1801. So, not an official war, but an almost war. It also known as the Undeclared War with France or the Half War. Fearful that French sympathizers might undermine U.S. war efforts, Congress chose to restrict free speech and deport these perceived aliens. Even in 1798, the Alien Enemies Act and its three sister acts were incredibly controversial. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison argued, so also two important founding fathers argued that they violated free speech and free press. So you couldn't critique the government or you got kicked out. That's a pretty big violation of free speech. Others claim that the acts violated the Fifth Amendment right to due process. You should be able to go through the court. In fact, when Jefferson was elected as president in 1800, so right after Adams, third president there, he pardoned those who were convicted under the act. The Alien Enemy Act does not have an expiration date and has been invoked 3 times since 1798. The War of 1812, probably for very similar reasons. Let's kick out the British during the War of 1812, World War I, and World War II. In World War I, the government incarcerated German citizens, German Americans, and restricted free speech. Between 1917 and 1920, the Alien and Sedition Acts allowed the U.S. government to intern German Americans in 4 camps across Georgia, North Carolina, and Utah. Many German language newspapers and churches closed as a result. This is World War I. At war, worried about some espionage, the Alien and Sedition Act also allowed the government to detain the first German prisoners of war in the United States in 1917. So let's round up all the Germans and get them in an internment camp, sort of a concentration camp. The Alien Enemies Act also justified Japanese American incarceration during World War II. Some of the saddest moments of World War II, often looked at as sort of this crowning achievement in American history. We sort of won the war, right? That's sort of the narrative. Well, there was the dark side where they rounded up a bunch of Japanese immigrants and people of Japanese descent and put them into concentration camps in the middle of the desert for the war. And many of the young men who were interred end up going and enlisting in the U.S. military and serving with a much higher rate of awards and medals than other units. And the law was being enforced and arresting Japanese people, people of Japanese descent without warrants or formal charges, very problematic. It also estimates that 3,000 suspected subversives were also rounded up amongst the German and Italian national ranks, but not as many as the Japanese. In 1942, Executive Order 9066 ordered the unlawful incarceration of more than 100,000 Japanese citizens. So what's now with the Alien Enemies Act? How's it been invoked? A president has full authority to invoke the act if a foreign government threatens or leads an invasion into the U.S., and it's up to the president to decide what is considered an invasion or predatory incursion. Since this is the first time the act has been used in peacetime, legal challenges could follow. In fact, a federal judge has already blocked its enforcement, and they're talking about impeaching the judge because of it. From here, the Supreme Court can decide whether the president has unlawfully invoked the act. So it's got to go through a Supreme Court, and many of the justices on the Supreme Court were put on there by Trump. So it's a pretty difficult situation right now. So in conclusion, we can see a transformation from limited Chinese-focused exclusions to more broad criminalization. We can also see how this can affect individuals alongside a broader population.